Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and today I want to talk about the idea of ceasing to ask what's next. I've noticed as my meditation has shifted a little bit away from learning how to focus, or even in the earlier days, trying to make my mind stop thinking, and also as my self-inquiry has become deeper over time, that there is a shift that starts to happen in which the mind begins to abide more in the way things are, which is interesting because in retrospect, that is the one thing that the ego doesn't want. Of the many things that the ego dislikes, perhaps the bigger one is not departing away from the now, not knowing what to do next, or not knowing what's next, because the ego, as a function of the mind, is the function to overlook things it doesn't like and depart away from them, at least attention wise, right? The ego has no command over time. Things are happening to it. But the thing that it can do to depart away from the moment is to place its attention in a mental world as opposed to the perceptual world. So it loves to depart. And the way it does that is to ask the question, so I wonder what to do next, or how do I make this better? And once that trigger is pulled, then a bullet departs away from the now and ever further away from the now into la la land, right? You pull the trigger of what should I be doing next, or how do I improve the now, and out the bullet shoots, and it takes you into a wild goose chase into the land, into Neverland, whilst the now is still happening, but is now happening under the threshold of your conscious perception. You've made the now unconscious, in other words, and therefore you've made yourself unconscious. And it strikes me as quite interesting that abiding in the now is such a distressful practice, actually. I had been running away from it quite a while, if I'm honest. Because so long as we are doing practices of focus or Tai Chi or journaling or this, that, and the other, we are keeping busy and moving forward. And in reality, what we need to learn how to do is to stand still. Now, that doesn't mean that those practices didn't have their value, because as it turns out, standing completely still is the highest possible skill. It's a very skillful state of mind. It's a mind that has learned to be in complete harmony with the way things are, and therefore it doesn't need to push and pull on them. And I'm now quoting Angelo Di Lullo, who he speaks a lot about pushing and pulling on the way things are. Now, we can't really push and pull on the way things are other than mentally, but we do it anyway. And to cease doing that, in other words, cessation of the mind's attempts to bring the next thing about, is therefore a very tall order. It's a very skill demanding practice, and a very skillful thing to do once we start to come to terms with that. It is also a more difficult practice than the other types of meditation, because it confronts us directly with a sense of eeriness in which we are kind of being invaded, not to say infected, by the present moment's emptiness and eeriness and loneliness and boredom. So all those things, emptiness, loneliness, boredom, existential angst, all of those live in the razor thin edge of the now. There is no space in that edge of the now for the self. That's why the ego hates it so much, because in the very edge of the now, the mind's capacity to know and its capacity to render content, let's call it like that, to generate reality, collapse into a single thing, and they squeeze the ego out of that equation. See, the ego can only live when our capacity to know and that which is there to be known are separated by a seeming entity that has the capacity to look away. But if that capacity to look away is, if we relinquish it, even if temporarily, if we take that prerogative and we lay it down on the table and say, I'm not going to touch that capacity to look away for a second, and I'm just going to sit and let reality creep in, then the ego starts to get really nervous because it's being squeezed out of the equation. Feels like dying, actually. That's why it's an existential terror, is literally that. Since I love to quote the Matrix, here we go again. After Neo takes the red pill, you'll remember his mind starts to disconnect from the Matrix. He touches a mirror, and the sort of mercurial, and I don't think that's a mistake, by the way, but the mercurial substance of the mirror starts to invade him, and he feels like he's being kind of invaded and taken over by that substance, right? And so it is that's his first death, and then there's the final death when Agent Smith actually invades him completely, and then the alchemical process is complete. So what we want to try and do is experiment with this. It feels very strange to sit and do nothing. It's not meditation in the sense that we're not trying to point our attention somewhere. We're not trying to cultivate the mind or embodiment or self-inquiry or anything of any specificity or goal whatsoever. We simply allow the perceptual now to be what it is and to completely invade us and creep in as if we were a sponge and reality was water, and we're being kind of invaded by it. And so it needs to settle into us. It doesn't just need to settle, it needs to settle in. There needs to be contact. There needs to be this kind of invasive sensation. And part of that reality is going to be emotions that we don't want to feel, or thoughts that demand that we pay attention to them, and so on. So in a sense, it's kind of a very advanced practice, if we want to call it that. It's abiding in pure being, if you will. I believe in Zen is called shikantaza. I've been avoiding it like the plague because it just creeps me out. And but now that I've started to practice it, I start to see the sense in it, and I start to notice that if I allow that eeriness to creep in, then suddenly I merge with the now in a non-dual way. All right, so to squeeze the ego out and become non-dual, this kind of abiding mind needs to be trained so that it is not trying to do anything in the practical sense, but also not trying to do anything in the spiritual sense, but simply knowing how to abide in its own luminosity and in the content that luminosity produces, without trying to modify it, focus on any particular datum of experience, or form an opinion about it. But even if opinions are formed, that is just another part of the content that is in which we're abiding, right? So there's no rejection of rejection. There's no rejection of thought. There's no rejection of distraction. There's no rejection of focus. It is simply an abiding state of the mind. And that's when the mind really starts to bloom. Everything else, all the practices about embodiment, focus, and even self-inquiry are all practices so that the mind starts to become more focused, more stable, and some of its structures start to become more transparent, so that once we abide, none of them can take us out of the abiding state. Yeah. So long as the mind lacks some of these other qualities, then the abiding state of pure being, pure knowing / being, is going to be very difficult to maintain, because the qualities of the mind are simply not there to underpin it. Yeah. So in essence, this is an invitation to try that out, to notice that our egoic tendency, or our primary egoic tendency, is to look for the elsewhere or the next, and to simply sit and really actually sit it out and do nothing and allow the eeriness, the angst, the loneliness, the boredom to come up is what we want to try and do. We want those things to come to the surface so that we can abide in them as nothing other than protection mechanisms of a mind that doesn't want to see its supposed self identity or its supposed separate identity and specialness question. It needs to protect it because it isn't real. Yeah, and so all those feelings are on the one hand alerts of the mind that preclude you from going there, and on the other hand they are clear indicators that you're going precisely in the right direction, because the egoic sense of self is being squeezed out of the equation by that practice of abiding. And once we start to abide in the now with full openness, and we let it really take us over, then we start to notice that there was nothing to be afraid of, that we weren't really there was nothing to protect, and that we are now in a loving relationship with the now, and therefore in a loving relationship with ourselves, and that everything else was just a kind of manipulative tactic so that things would pan out in a certain way, and that we could appease our anxieties and our fears. So I hope you liked today's topic, and I'm very curious what you make of it. So do share it in the comment section. And as usual, if you think that this content could benefit others, then your liking, sharing the video, and subscribing to the channel is very motivating, and it also makes the channel more popular out there, hopefully. I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Thanks for listening. Cheerio, and bye-bye.